Okay. Welcome back to the Metagame. I'm here with Alex Zhu and Romeo Stevens, both of you previous guests on this podcast. And today we're going to do something a little bit different, something I've never done before, where we're going to have a disagreement. I have a lot of respect for both of you. I've been challenged to think of the world in different ways through conversations with each of you on spirituality, dharma, personal transformation. And there's a sense in which you both see the world in different ways. And so we're going to see where that is and find something constructive where the two of you depart. And the starting point for the conversation today will be on perennialism, or the perennial philosophy, which my layperson definition, just to start us off, is it's something like the leading world religions are all actually pointing to the same thing, especially when you consider their more mystical sects or branches. And Alex, you're in favor of this, or you're favorable to this, and Romeo, you have some disagreements with it. So I thought a good place to start is, Alex, if you could give your definition of perennialism and then your position and why you hold that position. Take as much time as you want, and then we'll go over to Romeo and to see where he departs, and then we'll let the conversation unfold from there.
Sure. The brief definition you gave, I think, characterizes my overall view pretty well. An analogy that feels resonant for me is plane geometry, like circles and lines and like what we typically call Euclidean geometry. But that was discovered independently in China as well, and India as well, and to some extent by the the Babylonians had a concept of pi. I think they said pi equals 3 1/8, like 3.125. That's wrong, but like they were trying to grasp at a thing. And it's not clear to me how much cross-pollination there was between like the Babylonians and the Greeks and the Chinese and the Indians and whoever else discovered plane geometry, but they all had some form of it. They all had discovered a lot of the same theorems. A lot of the theorems they discovered weren't quite this. Like some civilizations discovered some theorems that didn't show up in others. The Babylonians said pi equals 3.125, and like we know that's wrong, but like, you know, we could see what they were grasping at, what they were trying to do. And in that sense, that seems to me like a good analogy for my sense of like there's sort of just being some sort of underlying truth that different peoples in different cultures can all discover, and perhaps capture slightly different versions of, but really they're kind of pointing toward the same thing. Roughly speaking, my sense is that all the major world religions were founded by mystics who got in touch with this shared core thing, and presented it in ways that were appropriate for the cultures they were in and the time periods they were from, with lots of mimetic decay happening as the mystics who like actually understood what these truths were about faded out and got replaced by people who where all they could do was sort of like understand the words and the rituals and the doctrines, but without sort of being in touch with the core spiritual essence behind the teachings. I think the first thing I want to say is that I don't consider myself an expert on religions or mystical traditions. I only have I know very little about the actual mystical traditions of most religions. Like I haven't studied any of them in much depth, like probably Buddhism the most, but even then, like I'd still consider myself like beginner intermediate as a meditator or like on the path of the Dharma. And my knowledge of religions mostly just comes from like reading Wikipedia articles, and like getting high and just like Googling stuff and finding stuff that's fun and interesting and edifying. So that's like a lot of where I'm coming from. And I think these caveats are relevant and important for me to name with regards to my actual positions here. I think I'd say there are two main reasons why perennialism seems true to me. I think the first one is sort of more like a normative claim than a descriptive claim, which is something like that which the religions have in common is more important than that which sets them apart. Some religions are like, you have to perform these rituals or else you'll go to hell. And then a different religion is like, you'll have to perform these rituals or else you'll go to hell. And I think the religions themselves vastly under constrain what the scope of possible interpretations are. I think there are ways of interpreting them where those things are just directly contradictory and there's no room for reconciliation. When I think of like the median Christian and like the median Muslim, for example, like there's just not that much room for reconciliation between their worldviews. And part of where I'm coming from is a place of like, well, actually, if you look at the ways of interpreting these religions that actually seem most conducive to living well, you find that these interpretations actually are quite mutually compatible. And this is the stance I personally take when reading about religions and the religious leaders and what they were teaching and how they were acting, where one thing I get a lot from my readings of Islam, for example, is what it looks like to be a spiritual leader who's also a political leader and a general and has to navigate embodying spiritual ideals while also making trade-offs around not getting murdered by angry kinsmen who don't like that you're saying true things that are threatening the power they have. Which I don't know if that's what actually happened, but that's like one reading of The Rise of Muhammad that I find very educational. And in Muhammad's life, I just see exemplars. I just see him making subtle trade-offs between the spiritual ideals and the practical on-the-ground realities, and just like having lots and lots of data points for those in a way that I don't see as clearly articulated in what I've encountered in the other religions. And so that's just me saying a bit about how I feel like the way that I read and interpret religions, I get complementary things from them. Relatedly, when I visited the Parliament of World Religions in 2023, there was like a Deep System 1 update I had, just like talking to Catholic priests and imams and rabbis, just like being friends with each other and like actually embodying like, yeah, my religion is just one possible path toward spiritual truth, and like it's not necessarily any better or worse than yours, like it just happens to be the one that I personally most prefer, and that I identify most with. Kind of like, it's like I got my culture, you've got your culture, I've got my language, you've got your language. Like I walked into like a room where a bunch of Catholics were, and like I just saw a pamphlet that said free Quran reading, and I asked the people, they're like, "What is this? Is this not heresy?" And they were like, "Nope, this is very squarely within. It is very squarely within Catholic doctrine that like everything we're saying and embodying about some interpretations of Islam being incompatible with our interpretations of Catholicism. This just does not contradict Catholic doctrine. Catholic doctrine is like, there's a pretty broad scope of how you can interpret it." From talking with these people, I learned of the terms religious exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism, where exclusivism is like, my religion is the only way, which is, I think, what most people associate with religion. Inclusivism is like, my way is the best way out of many possible ways, and pluralism is like, my way is one way out of many possible ways. Going to the Parliament of World Religions felt like the first time I was actually talking with a bunch of inclusivists and pluralists for the first time. And I think there was this shared sense of dismay that we all had, that the exclusivist narratives seemed to be the dominant, the most dominant ones, but also that sort of seemed like a contingent fact about the world and not necessarily like an intrinsic fact about the religions. And I could imagine a world where instead the mainstream interpretations of religions are all pluralist instead, and like the dominant religious authorities are all pluralist, and the exclusivists are a minority, rather than the other way around, which is what we see today. Yeah, that was like me talking about one broad reason. Well, I believe in perennialism, which is just that there's a sort of particular orientation and interpretation I have of religions that I've seen shared by bona fide religious leaders, uh, that isn't like the most common or mainstream one today, but seems compatible with all the religions, at least like at how the pluralists are seeing it, and has the religions more or less be mutually compatible with each other. Like there might be some places where some religion is saying the analog of pi equals 3.125, but I'm just like, look, that's like a rounding error. That's not like a hill to die on. That's yeah, like we don't have to care too much about that. I think the other main reason I believe in perennialism is that as I've been undergoing my own mystical journey and trying to make intellectual sense of what various mystics are talking about, I get the sense that there is something like an underlying metaphysical structure of reality that the mystics tune into and gain knowledge and understanding of, and that questions about like the nature of consciousness and what happens when you die, and whether there's something like whether love is really in control or has the ultimate power on how things are unfolding in the universe, that are answers to questions like those, I think fall out of the ultimate metaphysical structure of reality. I'm going to use that with scare quotes. And one sort of operationalization I've come up with for what, like, if I could like sum up in a nutshell what all different religions have in common, is to live as though you're going to have a life review when you die, where the life review is a thing commonly reported in your death experiences, where people basically talk about re-experiencing their whole lives in high resolution, both from their perspective and everyone else's perspectives, where a lot of the people report afterwards just like having a visceral sense of like, oh yeah, it's really not possible for me to help or hurt another without helping or hurting myself in turn, because I'm going to experience that myself when I die. Whether literally every person actually experiences this kind of thing, like somewhere in their death transition, sort of, I'm not gonna like die in the hill of like that's literally what happens for every person, but it does seem plausible to me that something like that, like a weaker version, is kind of just like everything we dissociate from or try to unsee in the course of our lifetimes, we eventually have to account for. And that sort of seems like a weaker claim that I think is convergently present, at least implicitly, across all the world religions. And that captures a lot of what seems to matter about the life review bit that I was describing. I think there's more I could say, but I think I'll leave it here for now.
Yeah, that's a good start. Romeo.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff. It's difficult to know where to start. So I think I want to try to start with some material on which restricted claims of perennialism seem reasonable, and why. And then that as a launching pad for the problems with some of the claims that I see. And I don't know how well I'll actually pull that off. It's a big talk. So yeah, how do I want to slice it? One of the issues with perennialism is that there's different takes on it, and part of like the metastructure moves around depending on the take. Like where you push the is-ought question. So like, for example, are we talking about moral realism and like whether or not perennialism grounds it provides an answer to moral realism? Or are we talking about more of a like coherence correspondence theories of episteme? Like, are we talking about this is coordination tech that has worked for humans really well, and because humans all have shared architecture, like hardware, then like this is a very strong candidate answer for how humans should organize themselves. And that second one doesn't necessarily need to bridge the is-ought gap. It doesn't necessarily assume that this is morally true in like all worlds. So it's like a weaker claim, or a person might do that, but then be moving the is-ought question somewhere else in the stack.
Can I just quickly share some thoughts in response to that?
Yeah.
I resonate strongly with perennialism meaning kind of different things to different people. I think Aldous Huxley was the one who popularized the term with the book The Perennial Philosophy, and that book frustrates me. Like I don't know. I think I might not be giving it a fair shake, but I just like found it hard to interface with, and I just found like I kept bouncing off of it. And it seems relevant to note that I'm like, yeah, I believe in perennialism, and also like the guy who popularized it and wrote a book about it, like I feel personally frustrated by that book. So yeah, I'm with you there about the term being under constrained and possibly meaning lots of different things, many of which I'm not sure I buy. The second thing is that I want to clarify that for me, the perennial philosophy does address the is-ought problem. And if an alien civilization like elsewhere in the universe became advanced enough, I think they would have their own version of the perennial philosophy and their own version of... They would come upon an analogous resolution of the is-ought problem that would also turn out to be very good coordination tech for them. And then if they became advanced and we became advanced enough that we're able to talk with each other, then that coordination tech that we both independently discovered should be able to help us and the aliens coordinate as well.
So I'll try a couple cuts. Like one is top down versus bottom up. And so we might view sort of top down as compression. The perennial philosophy itself is an attempt at compression over a bunch of religious wisdom, right? And in general, humans are doing a lot of compression because we have to throw out most of our sense data in order to make sense of things and port our knowledge across different situations. But then there's a negative result of this, which is that we're constantly seeking various things like the perfect compression, which we now in the modern era know doesn't exist, or we have proofs that there is no such thing as the final optimal compression. You never have a proof that you have the final compression. Bottom up, we might view it as like, okay, there's sense data coming in, and then there's a selection effects on that sense data, like the worlds in which tribes of humans survive, their sense data gets updated on, and the sense data of the people who didn't survive and reproduce doesn't get updated on in a certain sense, right? Your genome / phenome, like it's all could be viewed as a compression over all of that historical data. The question I'm trying to answer is like, whence the shared structure, right? So one answer is, well, humans have a lot of shared architecture. And so you'd expect that there'd be some shared structure in anyone perceiving truths about how humans can go about coordinating with themselves and others and dealing with various problems universal to the human experience. Another source of shared structure is the universe itself, right? That it seems to be very structure rich, and that there seem to be, for instance, mathematical structure to voting theorems, right? So one of the perennial problems of humans is, how do we aggregate our preferences? How do I know my preferences? How do I know another person's preferences? How do we aggregate honestly? How do we avoid all of the layers and layers of deception and misunderstandings and ignorance? And so you might combine these to reach an answer like, well, so there's some objective or third person shared structure in the sense that given any kind of constraints, there's going to be certain necessary truths that are the obvious logical implications of those, like voting, like the various properties of voting terms. Like if you define your stuff like this, then you're going to get these other certain necessary truths. And then within that huge space of possible structure, you have like what's reachable by human psychology, given that humans all share a lot of hardware. And then you of course you already run into problems like, do humans all share the same hardware, right? Such that your gnosis is the same as my gnosis because we expect that our hardware is overlapping enough that we're really perceiving the same truths. Are we creating a joint reality by sort of mimetically inducing each other into the same spaces of brain configuration? Or are we discovering pre-existing structure that's there for everyone? And then there's also questions of like psychological developmental appropriateness. So we expect that the successful world religions are ones that manage to have some like functional structures for people at varying levels of psychological development, right? For children through different stages of life, et cetera, et cetera. And if people at very different stages are disagreeing with each other about the optimal thing, well, then you run into, you know, the problems of exclusivity, as we were just going into, right? My friend Anish has a very nice quip. I am the Lord, thy shelling point. Thou shalt have no other shelling points before me. And that sort of it exposes some of the inherent tension that you can run into with any coordination tech. If everyone is claiming, well, we have the universal optimal answer, but there's a bunch of free parameters in that, or a bunch of free dimensions, and those are different, then, well, it's not going to be able to coordinate among. It doesn't have enough metastructure to resolve those types of disagreements. And resolving those types of disagreements, as far as we can tell from our current position, requires people of a high level of psychological development. And it's like, well, you're just you keep wrapping back into these self-referential problems of knowing what's true for you, knowing what's true for others, how to coordinate with them, given the differences, and whether or not those differences are fundamental or just conditional, or what's the term? Circumstantial.
Right now I'm doing a combination of like feeling more into the general vibes of where you're coming from and thinking about a particular response to something that you'd said. Before doing that, I want to ask you a different question that I think feels pretty relevant. You had this talk or video about the Supercooperation cluster or something like that. And I remember liking it, and also the big question in my head being like, and why is there only one? Like why couldn't there be like multiple super coordination clusters that
you can have
conflict with each other?
multipolar, but you can imagine that the most robust one, let's say that there's 2 or 10 or 1 million,
Yeah.
ones that are more robust almost by definition, I think, I haven't thought about this in a while, but we can explore if it's interesting, would be trying to figure out, how do I bridge to the other really big chunks? Because that would be one of the biggest sources of like wins, right? If you in fact if it turns out that you have a conflict, so, you know, there's 2 billion Christians or whatever, and there's 1 billion Muslims. If it turns out that there is in fact a bridge that's useful, that's one of the most important things available, because that obviates all of the current wasted resources on conflicts between those 2 huge clusters. And so if those 2 clusters have any comparative advantage at all, which, you know, the vast majority of the time there's going to be some comparative advantage, even in freeing up computational resources to explore different parts of, you know, reachable space, then you'd want to invest some efforts into bridging those between those chunks. So then the chunks that are bridged become part of the bigger metastructure of, here's all of the reachable spaces. Anywhere within this space is theoretically reachable from somewhere else in the space, such that all the beings in it can, by some definition, coordinate, even if it might be quite far away sometimes. They're doing quite different things.
For what it's worth, I share very similar intuitions. It does seem like one of the uh pieces that you were leaning on for what you just said is that this kind of bridging is always going to be tractable.
No, not necessarily. It's you're going to expend some effort investigating whether it's tractable, because if it turns out to be, it's a huge win. And so you're going to invest some fraction of that and say, hey, there's a 5% chance that we can bridge this huge gap. Oh, great. Like that helps us figure out how much should we invest in attempting to bridge that gap.
So just to paraphrase my understanding of what you said, maybe there might be a bunch of different super coordination clusters. To the extent that it's possible to bridge between those clusters, and have a new cluster that's essentially like the bridge of those clusters, that new cluster would be even more shelling than any of the original clusters that were bridged between. And it's worthwhile to investigate how much this can actually be done in practice, but there isn't necessarily any theoretical or practical guarantee that this will actually happen, or that like this will ever converge into like a single big main cluster.
Yeah, and one of those bridges might not like might be that mutually incompatible clusters. They've put in some work. They've discovered, oh, this doesn't actually work. We have too many rivalrous goods or something. Another option is you just orthogonalize intentionally. You're like, we're going to put ourselves onto like a substrate of physics where like we no longer have any rivalrous goods. We're not competing over the same star systems because like we don't care about stars anymore. We care about some weird particle that you guys can't even detect in your slice of the multiverse, right? So you like sort of intentionally it is a sort of coordination, but you could see them as sort of just like going their separate ways, like deciding to not compete over rivalrous goods because that's just increasing the surface area of conflict.
Got it. Yeah, this is helpful for my background models of your overall positions.
And to bridge this into like the real world instead of just being science fiction, some of the Vinaya, right? My perception reading between the lines is, well, the Buddha definitely didn't want monasteries to be politically relevant, because for them to be politically relevant then opens them up to threats and shenanigans of some of it, for instance, literally seems to be about make sure that that rulers are not like hiding their soldiers at monasteries pretending to be monks, right? Because then you're creating an incentive for the enemies to come in and kill all the monks, right? To prevent these sorts of shenanigans. So it's like, how can you head this off so that you create like a really, really solid, very expensive, costly signaling that this is not the case, that we're not engaged in these shenanigans, so that you just cut off entire branches of bad outcomes. So I think that this is relevant to the real world, and that there is something to the idea that the Gnostic, founders of any particular world religion are people who were directly perceiving sort of game theoretic equilibria in this way, and then attempting to figure out, how do I communicate this down the levels of psychological development so that the rules and correct behavior trickle down to those layers so that you can in fact coordinate better. So for instance, Jesus was like staring at the source code of Judaism and probably the other prophetic types of material that was bouncing around in the Middle East at the time, and was like, what's the, obviously it's Girard's supposition that he was like, okay, like let's say that I have some mimetic payload I can inject, but it's limited. Like, what's the one thing to really hammer on to like fix the entire downstream structure? Scapegoating, right? Like break one of the fundamental metaphysical assumptions that all of these, primitive from our point of view now, but just cause one of these societies like the Roman Empire and the extant Judeo religions at the time are doing, that is causing the most problems for human coordination, right? So like, let's get in there and cut at that thing, right? The Buddha had a different cut, right? He was like, microphenomenology, like tanha is the proximate cause of suffering, ignorance is the distal cause of suffering. Like you can in fact like cut there. So basically it's like choosing what to go for. And I see a lot of them as a deflationist, in the sense that they realized that they couldn't fix everything. And so they tried to make a particular cut to only solve one little particular node.
Is your position more like perennialism is false, or is it more like it's not clear what it's supposed to mean? And also for any particular thing it could mean, it doesn't seem like there's very clear evidence for it.
So the shared structure hypothesis seems like it has some trivially true things, right? Obviously, we're some humans have shared architecture enough. Maybe psychopaths or something are actually not fixable. We'll know in the future with better brain technology or something, but maybe they're not fixable or something due to just hardware constraints. There's some shared structure. The claim of moral realism is stronger because it's claiming that shared structure corresponds. It's not just coherence within humans, but it corresponds to something out in the universe robust enough that we expect it to apply to a broad slice of the multiverse, including creatures that live under much different game theoretic considerations. For instance, well, you can deflate the claim down enough that it becomes both trivially true. The Buddha and Jesus and Muhammad were all perceiving something, and because they were perceiving anything at all and trying to improve things, then, all humans are trying to improve things, right? You can make it as dumb as you want. But this doesn't help us make solid predictions, nor does it sort of help us pedagogically understand the structure of how are humans actually inducted into meaning orders that are better or worse at coordinating with other humans that might have disparate life experiences. Yeah, I guess it's tricky because I'm still not totally clear on, if we're really tackling the moral realism question, I think that's a very different conversation than we're tackling the human coordination problem.
Yeah, I think I just want to name that for me, the moral realism question of sort of implies different theoretical limits for human coordination or something like that. Like the specific bridge between moral realism and how do you actually coordinate humans feels messy and complicated to me, but also feels very substantive and important. Yeah, so I guess I just want to name that. And I also want to name that if the mystics didn't actually crack moral realism, that would feel like a crux for me for whether perennialism is true. For me, perennialism and the nuts and bolts of moral realism map to pretty much the same thing in my head. And so I guess I'm wondering whether that, how cruxy that feels for you.
So I don't think that the world's traditions agree about a bunch of things. I think that a close reading of, for example, the Buddha shows that he was pushing back pretty hard against a bunch of things that would be considered a lot more perennial within Hinduism, at least. And by extension, given the broad range of things Hinduism actually covers when you really map out all of the philosophical positions that line up with schools there, covers a lot of stuff that would be covered by other world religions subsequently too. So, for instance, in the top-down, bottom-up way of slicing this, I do believe that there are some traditions that believe that the final answer to, if you strip down everything and you do Gnosis and you get good at that kind of stuff, that the answer is top-down in the sense of transcendence, let my priors overwrite the world, right? Which is sort of jhanas and such. And that's the best you can do. And then there's other ones who are doing the exact opposite. They are saying, let the bottom-up sense data overwrite the entire, all of these priors. I think that's closer to your position of the stuck prior, sort of regarding all priors as sort of stuck priors, potentially. And then that's very much the non-dual, very present-oriented, now is the only thing that's real. And I think those are both ways that human beings seemingly can configure their nervous systems. And from the inside of being that nervous system, it's definitely going to feel like you have discovered the final answer. And the Buddha pushed back against both of these, right? He trained with yogis and was like, nope, neither of these are good enough. I have to keep going. And then, famously discovered something that's subtle enough that it's extremely difficult to put into words without lots of technical, spinning up a lot of practice and technical language.
Romeo, can you quickly sharpen up the distinction between the top down and the bottom up? What's different about the jhanas versus the non-dual approach?
Yeah, so in the top down approach, you're saying the world's an illusion. the world's full of shit. I'm not gonna take seriously what the world hands to me as sense data. I'm going to say, I've discovered that these compressions of good things, I'm going to like continue to like fine tune them and fine tune them and fine tune them until there are these perfect crystalline structures of pure compression of experience. And then I'm going to take that and I'm going to overwrite all of the bottom up sense data. And I'm just going to be in realms of jhanic bliss. Maybe I'll navigate through various realms, occasionally touching back into the human realm, but mostly just to say, hey, you guys should be doing the thing that I'm doing. You should be transcending and exploring these radical realms of platonic crystalline beauty with eternal truths, things that feel like eternal truths from the inside. Because once you associate your ego with pure platonic forms, you feel like you're immortal, all-encompassing, made of bliss, et cetera, right? But again, these are all functions of a human nervous system, not necessarily universal truths, even though they feel like universal truths from the inside, because that's how our notion of profound universal works. Compressions feel more universal, right? Like it's when they're lossless. You can also fool yourself that lossless compressions are lossy compressions are lossless by just throwing out, again, this is like the bottom up sense data. And then the bottom up is, I'm not going to take anything the mind generates seriously. Only the present moment is real. Everything else is delusion. All these projections, all these platonic forms, all this mathematical beauty, even valence in the body is a bit of can be a bit of a scam, right? And so I'm just going to, and then this is where the suffering is a delusion comes from. Because often the transcendence people believe that suffering is real, and that's what they're trying to get away from. They're like, well, the human realm is just garbage, it's full of suffering. The non-dual people is that suffering is actually an illusion. And some people think this is what Buddhism is talking about, but the first noble truth is supposed to be suffering is real. Anyway, staying in equanimity, right? Pure non-dual equanimity, where the entire sense sphere is in some sense symmetrized in a different way, to where it feels very, it can accept anything. It doesn't need to discriminate between things. It can accept anything and equally find it, equally regard it. Both of these are regarded as extremely useful and powerful tools by the Buddha, as far as I can tell. But he makes the distinction that they're tools and not the final goal. But anyway, I don't want to get too far into Dharma, because like I see, this is an illustrative example of ways that I think claims can differ substantially. And here, I guess I am making the claim that this is a created versus discovered distinction, that people can put their nervous system with years of training into different states, and those people will just inhabit different epistemic positions about the world. And I don't think that you can argue them out of it necessarily.
I think for me, the cruxy question is like, how much is that just it? Like, they just have these different conceptions of the end state that are not compatible, versus how much is it like they're each trying and grasping and have errors, like pi equals 3.125, and are maybe stuck to the point where they don't know how to get out of those errors. But like, maybe if you trained up a student with like that teacher and someone else, they could get the good things that the stuck person has while also seeing the errors and being like, oh, this is the thing that you're actually trying to get at.
Yeah, famously, people will get into states where they are like, oh, this is clearly the thing. I've clearly attained the final answer. And then only if they go on and experience 2 plus 3, 4 of those and see that they all have that quality from the inside, do they then start to do the more of the cross thing?
Yeah. So I think I'm just going to reflect back what seemed to me like potential points of agreement. Like within, like, Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism have pretty different vibes, like pretty different orientations toward what the goal is. And Buddhism's, like, both of those in turn are pretty different from Hinduism, at least how it was practiced at the time Buddhism came about. And so those are real and substantive differences. And one quality despite all these differences, and it's very easy for people like in each of these traditions to feel like, oh yeah, they've found the final answer. And these are different traditions that lead people into different states that lead them all to different final answers that are not compatible with each other. Therefore, if one is to say that secretly they're all trying to grasp toward the same thing, like one needs to be careful and do a lot of like be careful about doing the work about like specifying exactly where they're falling off the boat, and what this alleged shared thing is that they may or may not be moving closer to with these practices that make them feel like they're getting at the ultimate thing. This seems like a fair paraphrase.
Yeah. And I think it's notable, right, that none of the Gnostic founders of any of these traditions, I'm using the word Gnostic to mean like they're in touch directly with the thing rather than it's received or, yeah. None of them explicitly outlined a theory of pedagogy or a theory of, you know, coordination or fixing things on, they sort of chose a level on which to try to fix things.
Yeah, I think the main analogy that's coming up, the main thing that's coming up for me is like Gnosis is hard to do well, and it's hard to get very much intersubjectivity about the Gnostic states in a way where something of real substance is being talked about. Which I think like echoes my frustration with Aldous Huxley's book, The Perennial Philosophy, where it feels like he was basically just like quoting a bunch of Gnostics, saying a bunch of like vague high level stuff. I think the thing that frustrated me about Huxley's presentation of perennial philosophy is that it like took a lot of things in common between the Gnostics, but in a way that seemed like it didn't at all constrain moral philosophy. Whereas from my perspective, like moral philosophy is kind of the whole point. And it kind of like I have on my models of moral philosophy, Gnosis is a necessary component of actually grokking how to do moral philosophy right, but it's not, depending on what one means by Gnosis, I think it's not sufficient. And I think the question of how to do the Gnosis well, I think is also likely under constrained by the actual like texts and doctrines of the religions themselves. And I think I'm basically pulling a move here of like the differences in the mystical states that these Gnostics have described that kind of conflict with each other feel analogous to me to the differences in doctrines between religions that kind of conflict with each other, where the real point is more about what the mystical states and the doctrines are supposed to like represent, like locations on the path toward the real thing, or like as like tools to help one get to the real thing, but not as the real thing itself. And I think like this kind of just like invites the question of like, well, why, Alex, do you think there is a real thing in the first place? But yeah, before I start ranting about that, I think I want to check how that lands with you.
Yeah, real is a very useful pointer within the system, both for your personal practice and for these kinds of investigations. So I usually these days take real to mean more invariant, which feels viscerally more real because it's more applicable across more of experience. And so therefore is more stable, a better basis for consistent behavior, consistent choices, various things like this. Yeah, I should probably take a brief moment to just sort of like actually explain the intuition. Invariance is a different way of talking about symmetry. An invariant is it undergoes some transformation and it's the same. So it's invariant under that transformation. So compression is also the search for invariances within the data that you can exploit in order to make the data smaller. So compression, invariance, and symmetry are three ways of talking about the same thing. Moral intuitions is, for me, another way of saying symmetry intuitions, compression intuitions, invariance intuitions. And so, of course, religion feels like it is getting at fundamental reality, or like touches everything, and you can't like leave it alone, because almost by definition, like it's the structure, and the same way that math applies to everything. It's the structure of our symmetry intuitions, for instance, and that applies to all of experience, or potentially could. Now, there are different symmetries. It's not all the same. Again, there's no ultimate compression. There's no ultimate symmetry. It's just local choices that make a lot of sense. And you might expect that if aliens did show up one day and were under very different constraints, or we could speak to another branch of the multiverse or something that had very different physical constraints from ours, there would be not completely zero overlap in the library of invariants that you've built up, whether it's math or religious, or like ultimately what we're talking about in religion is like symmetries that are instantiated in the human CNS as part of its perceptual stack that then feeds back into its behavior and allows it to go about the world and do things, have behaviors over its sense data. So then the world religions become, hey, here are some people who say that there are some really great ways to fine-tune your nervous system to become much better at detecting symmetries, working with them, understanding what they are. And then almost by definition, you would probably quickly start seeing some very non-obvious ones that other people who hadn't undergone that training would see. You know, does Jesus leave any instructions for how to deal with future prophets? No, and that might be a significant part of the problem. There is no...
Oh, he said, by their fruits you shall know them, which feels sufficient to me. I feel like there's not much more you can say beyond that. And that, like, when I judge spiritual teachers, that's...
A founder can leave quite explicit instructions about how to engage with future ways that the teachings might interact with the world, right? I think that Muhammad and Buddha both left many more instructions, including meta instructions for, hey, when you run into conflicts in interpreting these instructions, how should you resolve some of those conflicts? Not complete coverings, but some, right? And we can lament that they didn't leave even more. It's like, well, if they had really, I don't know, I personally feel like if they'd really been thinking through the problem, they would have gone a little bit up the stack and been like, oh, I should probably leave some more explicit instructions besides just monks should follow this rule. Also, reasons why. This is actually a problem with the modern legal code too. The modern legal code is another artifact of like trying to compress huge amounts of human data about how to behave under a broad variety of ambiguous situations to resolve interpersonal conflict. It's probably like the most underrated corpus in terms of the study of philosophy, because it's this other massive corpus of interesting stuff.
Yeah, I think I maybe just want to say the core moral philosophy cross-perennialism thing, the way it lives in me. It's something like when you're not confused about your self-interest, then you will find that it is actually in your self-interest to act as though you came from behind a universal veil of ignorance through which all possible agents have come behind. Yeah. And like among humans, this would imply that like when interacting with other humans, it is in their self-interest to act in a way that's introduces sort of like a moral symmetry between them and all other humans, and would imply a sort of coordination mechanism between them.
Does this map onto the Andy Weir short story, The Egg, just for the listeners? Yeah, okay. I'll link that.
Like, I think Buddhism talks a lot about the nature of confusion about self-interest. And that has very strong resonance. Like the Buddhist path about like seeing through the self feels very aligned with the kind of thing I mean around becoming less confused about self-interest.
So I think this is underspecified enough. There's enough degrees of freedom in this that it is very possible for people to have violent conflict about how to unroll that stack in practice, right? And I think I'm going to take a slightly different cut there. Like, I think that is a result of us having no pedagogically or psychologically developmental level appropriate theory of pedagogy. Because in theory, if you did, then you could guide people through a series of transformations explicitly, rather than sort of leaving it up to no one really quite understands what causes some people to stall at certain levels and other people to continue.
Can I just say that I agree with that assessment, and also think that if we're like, if we buy epistemic realism, that there is and is, uh, and that like all-men agreement is possible in principle, you might also end up in a case where like in practice resolving those disagreements might not be possible before violent conflict. Um, and yet it still feels relevant and important that like the in principle epistemic reconciliation is possible. And I think I'm like only trying to make some, I'm not trying to make like a stronger claim, analogous claim in the case of morality.
Yeah, and there's an important sense in which violence is just running a different computational procedure for resolving the conflict, right? If the other utility functions aren't around anymore, well, there's no more conflict. And this has happened many times throughout history. I personally am like way more worried than anyone that I know that like they're like, well, humans seem to in the modern era have up to 5 moral intuitions, but some people seem to have less. And I'm like, did our ancestors have 12? Like, have we already gone through the winnowing, right?
I really like that one because I just thought about some indigenous people I know, and I'm like, yeah, they do seem to have more moral intuitions that
right?
Like, was it Haight, Jonathan Haight, who you didn't
Yeah, I
didn't
think
write
so.
about those? And
Moral
like,
moral
yeah,
sentiments, yeah.
it seems like they sure did.
So I think that our crux probably is closer to the moral realism because I think that we agree on a bunch of the stuff of like, yeah, surely there's a bunch of locally valid coordination tech, and obviously people who undergo processes that you know, again, you have to, you wind up, whenever you try to define something like this, you wind up using other terms that themselves have problematic definitions, like healthy CNS. And I think you can ground them out, but there's many rabbit holes along the way, right? So like a healthy CNS, well, it can more robustly respond to a larger variety of sense data, including insults. It can have, it can receive damage and like heal more easily, various things, right? Like, I don't think that this idea that like, oh, health is totally subjective. Like, no, I just don't buy into that.
Can I just register that of everything you said in this conversation so far, the thing that like most jumped out to me as like possibly housing a super concrete and substantive disagreement was the thing you were saying of like, oh yeah, for some utility functions, conflict is just violence is just a good way to resolve conflict. Like if you get rid of the different utility functions that are trying to do things differently from you, that's like the solution to your problems. I might have mangled your words, but
So in theory, so we don't know. So it's possible that we live in the universe where, given the latent space defined by the utility function of the people who happen to be around, that if those beings evolve far enough and explore far enough, they will wind up recreating all of the things that they thought that they had flensed away, right? Oh, we killed that other tribe that had a different utility function. It's like, well, eventually in the future, when you have enough spare capacity and enough exploration, you will simply reproduce the utility function of that tribe, because my view of the Supercooperation cluster is that it is in fact the cooperation between the largest possible set of utility functions that are in theory capable of coordinating, right? It's like, we suspect that probably there are in fact utility inverters that you have to, like, if you do want them around at all, you have to like put them in holodecks, right? You have to like maintain martial superiority over them, because otherwise they're going around inverting people's utility, which is the worst possible thing by definition.
yeah, okay. I think the way you're talking about utility functions feels related, in my view, to where the crux lives.
Sure. I mean, it's just a choice of representation. It might be that it's secretly not there because it's just a representational conflict rather than a actual underlying conflict.
Yeah, I think I'm sort of like a mistake theorist about, yeah, a mistake theorist at my core or something.
Yeah, so this is eventually an empirical claim, but I don't know that it's not an empirical claim in the current time, right? So like, all utility functions given a sufficient time for under self-reflection converge is close to, it's close to one of the core perennial claims. It's like one of the positions that perennialists take on. I don't know that it outputs any testable claims in the current milieu. Maybe you disagree with that.
It would imply a serial killer who wanted to sort of like heal his sociopathic tendencies uh with the help of like super advanced psychotechnologies that don't currently have the surgical precision necessary for this to happen, could in fact succeed with that. Which I guess is consistent with your claim that like in the current milieu there might not be much that's testable.
It is interesting that there are current technologies that are not being leveraged simply because of coordination failures, right? So we in theory could be screening for sociopathy with brain scans, but because the additional metastructure around the things that would allow that and prevent it from being abused or captured by the very processes that we're trying to use it to improve things, it just doesn't get used. And this has only become recently possible, right? Literally like last 30, 40 years.
Okay, I think one empirical claim that does feel related to the overall sentiments I'm expressing is that if we had a much, much better understanding of the complex system that is the human body, a substantial portion of cancer treatments in the future might work by renormalizing the cancer cells and somehow like having them reconnect with what the rest of the body is doing. Where like Mike Levin has done a couple of small experiments where some cells that were like just about to be cancerous or like very slightly cancerous, after reconnecting them with the rest of the bioelectric network, they normalized.
Yeah, and broadly speaking, this is an interesting point for the general audience who are not familiar with it. There's a whole hypothesis that's pretty recent that cancer is caused by a breakdown in intercellular signaling, that it is only when cells are in a cooperate equilibrium with other cells around them, and when communication channels break down such that they can no longer confirm that they're in a cooperate scenario, then they defect and go like, well, I'll just become immortal, and because why wouldn't you? And just reproduce as much as possible. Oh, there's sugar, great, more and more sugar. You just make more cells, because that's the original programming prior to the multicellular higher level coordination thing.
Yeah, and I think like my view is sort of like we all coordinate is kind of like the moral null hypothesis. And then like, for example, different human cultures, because of having to navigate different environments, have internalized different conceptions, normalized for themselves different versions of evil. And then as a result, it kind of feels natural to see all the different cultures walking around and just being like, oh yeah, like they just like doing things their way, we just like doing things our way. And yeah, there's something I don't quite like about what I said, because I think there can be differences that come from different environments that don't have anything to do with moral conflict. But like there might be different collective shadows that like the culture in each culture might have their own collective shadow that they don't recognize as collective shadow. They just think of as like how things are. When really there's some portion of the collective psyche that's just like doing defects on everyone else. And I think a core part of my overall thesis and like the worldview I'm experimenting with is like, yeah, all of the apparent conflicts and utility functions are mostly of this sort. And therefore, like, in principle, reversible.
Yeah, I see this as a stronger claim that's not falsifiable unless someone comes up with something really clever. So like sort of like the trivially true and trivially false versions generate predictions, but the ultimately is the latent space of all possible utility functions of coherent agents. You know, if we want to like head in the direction of like Langen and like Church-Turing thesis, like well human CNS is sufficient. It's not just totally arbitrary. It's sufficient to perceive, like universal computability. So therefore there is something like that's sufficient. You're over the threshold. You can in fact represent anything in theory, although some of it might be quite computationally intractable. So therefore you are in principle able to perceive universal truths, et cetera, et cetera. So we're in the same basis like space as all the other possible utility functions of coherent agents. It's not like we're off in our own little corner somewhere. And then the question about that broader space, is that all a basin where fundamentally that entire space can be a cooperation cluster? Or is the topological shape of that space such that there are different basins that fundamentally can't agree with one another? Is that possible? I think locally, just de facto, humans instantiate adversarial utility functions, which might be a mistake, but until we develop better pedagogical induction methods to cause people to be able to perceive the ignorance of that more clearly, as soon as you do that, meta questions start popping out. So, for instance, let's say that because it's exactly back to Huxley. It's you develop that technology, and now you have a civilization that is doing this, and then someone comes along and says, well, sure, but this isn't natural. This is just its own little chunk of the space. Like, if you weren't doing this, potentially some other totally different culture could arise that has sharp disagreements with this culture, and you are in fact cutting off important branches of reachable areas of the human or even non-human experiences, right? So for instance, Boltzmann brains or something. If you have a little flash in the pan, 2 seconds of qualia just arising out of the quantum flux, it itself, it's a self-authoring qualia. It's like it's happy that it got to exist, and it's like it asserts that like, oh, there's high moral value in the fact that I got to exist. Is there a fact of the matter about other people agreeing or disagreeing with that? Right. It certainly sounds good in the way that I constructed it just now locally. But
how much of this is a question of moral realism and your positions on it? Because I feel like that's lurking in the background the whole time.
Yeah, that's the rabbit hole. And like, because Christopher Langan essentially feels that he has like, if not an answer, then like a much more tractable approach, or like something that handles a bunch of the apparent contradictions in the existing representations for this. But just like with Dharma, it's like ultimately quite hard to talk about in a useful way, is my experience so far. Dharma is for what it's worth, it makes a bunch of particular claims about how to orient a human nervous system, but the broader claim of like, oh, well, this is just the set of principles by which any being could come to better understand the conditions that gave rise to itself, and whether or not those experiences are endorsed or disendorsed. And that it's like a definition of health. It's like, well, it's healthier for beings who are not ignorant and deluded about their own causes and conditions. It's better for them to be aware of them so that they can meaningfully shepherd their own experience and the experience of beings nearby who are like them, right? They're like their own children, for instance. It's like, okay, well, I understand exactly how I came to have the desirable properties that I have and the undesirable properties that I have, and desirable and undesirable things in the environment. So then I can instill that into another being, or offer help or receive help, make myself the being that could, in the shape that could receive more help, like all sorts of things like this, right? It's just, Dharma just literally means like life in living life in accordance with the set of conditions that are conducive to life, right? It's ultimately a self. It's a coherence theorem, not a correspondence one. It famously does not make correspondence claims metaphysically out to the universe of about this is the way things really are, et cetera, et cetera. It makes things close to this is the way human nervous systems seem to be. At least when I drill down on the claims, that's what it seems to be directly claiming. This is exactly how a human nervous system processes things. Probably other mammals too. Insects, reptiles, it starts to get slightly iffier, but we suspect that there's decent overlap that even there. Even down to bacterium in some cases, right? Attraction and aversion seem to be the core moves a bacterium can make. Move along this gradient.
I think I'm just going to attempt to summarize my current sense of our cruxes. I think there's one that's something like how empirically it seems like we can, if we model humans with utility functions, these utility functions really conflict. It's possible that these conflicts are the result of mistakes on the part of each of the beings with utility functions involved. If that were true, that, and like if there existed some good pedagogy for transmitting the kinds of perennialist insights that would help people correct those mistakes, that would be, we would be in a world in which moral realism, that kind of world seems more compatible with moral realism, and that kind of moral realism seems to be directly related to the perennial philosophy. And furthermore, if this were the case, this would also seem more concordant with the idea that like there might be like a sort of single ultimate metaphysical truth a la Langen that one supercooperation cluster would converge upon, as opposed to there just being like various different clusters. However, these claims, this rests on the possibilities that like all of these apparent conflicts in fact come from mistakes, and that these mistakes are in fact like in principle correctable with the right kinds of pedagogy. And it seems like I'm a lot more optimistic about those than I think if I became like a lot more pessimistic about both of those points, I feel like my view would feel a lot more like your views. And I think I just wanted to check like how much that feels like a double crux instead of just like a crux for me.
Yeah, I'll deflate it to reach closer to my position. And that way it can illustrate the contrast. So it doesn't matter whether or not we can perceive whether or like even believe that there could be some sort of final answer, or if that's a sensible means of constructing things at all. What matters is the same procedure that you're talking about, but I would frame it rather than in terms of an answer or moral realism, whether or not you are generating more qualia moments that are self-authoring, right? So it's like the criticism that I mentioned before of a person comes in and says, well, this society is missing things. And it's like, sure, but like we're trying to generate beings that endorse being alive and that have the slack to investigate exactly the kinds of questions that you are coming here and offering us, which is like, maybe you're missing something. It's like, great, well, I need slack to investigate that. I need spare compute. So like, if you are against a society that has spare compute, if you want to throw things into a Malthusian cycle or something, then actually, yes, we will employ force against you, because you are, in fact, by asserting that this set of possibilities might exist, you are cutting off the broader space of possible reachable nodes, because you are destroying the preconditions that lead to exploratory behaviors, for instance. And so by that metric, a person can say, well, there's no moralism, so there's nothing to say that your society is actually better or worse. And it's like, sure, that's fair. All we're doing is we're generating a society that can, in principle, in the future, generate substantially more slack, more exploration, such that we can hopefully come to even better answers about that. And your society cannot include ours, but in theory, in the future, our society could include yours. Yeah, it's basically another take on the paradox of tolerance. It's saying tolerant societies should not be infinitely tolerant of intolerant societies, because those societies will curtail the space of possibilities.
Okay. How did this connect to the...
Because I'm saying it doesn't, as long as you are maintaining open the possible lines that in the future you can continue your investigation, you don't need to come to a lot of conclusions right now. So like moral realism, we don't need to like have a sense of whether it's possible or not. We just need to create better conditions under which people can investigate that question. So for me, so like I'll bring it all the way back around to a concrete question. One of the theses of this conversation is, do the world's mystic traditions have anything to tell humans about navigating an intelligence explosion, for instance? And of course, even that represented, like, there's many ways of framing it and slicing it and stuff, and it's very tricky. The core question from the point of view of the doomers is, well, a significantly more powerful being, we're guessing that there's a substantial fraction of worlds in which it does not regard itself as losing access to any reachable exploratory nodes. by defecting against humans. And if it's just that, if it's just a fact of the matter about it, and if it's just trying to figure out how can I deploy my compute in the best way possible, then there's many worlds in which it's up to that determination, right? Whether or not it correctly or incorrectly judges whether or not it's cutting off any space of the possible computing landscape by defecting against us. And that's a particular frame. There's several other ways to slice it. I was just trying to illustrate like one particular example, but like I don't know if it actually worked.
That again sort of feels to me related to the question of like what is the actual space of like possible coordination clusters, which in turn felt related to me to the question of like how much do apparently conflicting utility functions stem from mistakes. I guess that's feeling to me again like a crux, and I think I again want to check like how much those things feel like cruxes for you.
How much it feels like mistakes.
Like the apparently conflicting utility functions coming from like oh actually they do want to act from behind the veil of ignorance, but then they ended up in somewhere along their development trajectory, just like cancer cells, they ended up doing defect against each other.
Yeah, so like let's say that we have like Buddhism with an Air Force, and they're like, okay, we're gonna not just take for granted that like some kingdom takes care of things, and then we just meditate in like a nice park, right? Like actually, you're fully in the world with like lots of conflicts going on around you, and you think that many people are deluded about their conflicts, but nonetheless, they are in fact shooting at each other. So there's sort of this question of like, you are going to by necessity deploy force in order to assert certain things, make the world like one way rather than another. Even if you assert force into your hamstrings in order to walk to the fridge and eat an apple, because eating an apple is better than starving to death, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So I guess what I'm saying is it doesn't matter if it's like ultimately mistakes, because you have to have decision procedures to resolve local mistakes in some way. And the question is, do the world religions provide a reliable method by which people can take what starts off as incomplete preferences, right? They're confused about their own preferences. They're confused about decision procedure. A lot of it's just mimesis, copying what they see in the world. Does it take a person from that to being in principle the sort of person who can investigate the causes and effects of their own decision procedure, and through themselves or in conjunction with other people who are doing a similar procedure, come to better understand over time ways in which those mistakes might be manifesting and stop hitting themselves? Is the relevance
of this question kind of like, well, even if there are theoretically conflicts, like if there's nothing practical you can, even if the conflicts stem from mistakes in theory, if there's nothing pragmatically you can do about that fact or like leverage that fact to actually reduce the conflict, for example, by like utilizing teachings for the religions, then there's not really much point in talking about this.
Yeah. So the example of martial force is something like, okay, let's say that there's two people fighting. Do you use superior force to the force that they're deploying against each other to separate them on the thesis that, well, they're mistaken, and if they were to reflect upon this conflict, like let's say that you see them fighting and it's literally over something that doesn't exist, right? Like they thought that they were fighting over the last can of Coke, and it turns out there's two cans of Coke. It's like, well, I think that they would actually want to, if I draw a line around them as agents, right? Like I sort of like think that abstractly they would want to be prevented from fighting on the basis of the false, because they're going to potentially pay large costs that they didn't realize that they didn't need to pay. And then we get into like temporal resolution problems of like, where do you draw boundaries around agents? How do you like coordinate with themselves over time? And again, so I was lumping all of that. Maybe it's probably pretty non-obvious. I'm lumping all of that under the term self-authorizing qualia or self-authoring qualia. So it's like, you might in fact endorse someone utilizing force against you under certain circumstances, given your whole decision procedure. But of course, we've seen how that's played out in terms of world religions, right? Because there's this constant attractor pull back down towards cancer. So if cancer is smart enough to deploy complex reasons why you should feed it more sugar, right? Like, including the fact that it's a valid life form and it should deserve just as much consideration as any other life form, right? Like, to what extent all of the moral injunctions that we receive from different religious traditions are making representational assertions about which sorts of beings, usually it's humans and a particular conception of humans. Arguably, one of the reasons Christianity is interesting is that it actually slightly changed the conception of what humans were in a way that's kind of hard to talk about, because now we live in the aftertime. The meme like shifted. And people, I think, rightly perceive that Buddhism is like attempting, but kind of failed to do a slightly different transformation to people's sense of what they actually are. One it definitely has overlap with the Hindu one of actually you're being experiencing many lifetimes. And that, if true, would be a really big claim that would affect things a lot. But it's not clear if the Buddha was trying to leverage the pre-existing metaphysical beliefs for pedagogical reasons. As soon as representation becomes fluid, the moral questions get a lot more complicated, because if I'm going to say, hey, you're fighting against me right now, but really you wouldn't be fighting against me if you knew the truth, this is also a argument proves too much and is, what's the term? Hijackable by processes that you don't actually endorse as well. If that makes sense. Like, at the extreme, the terrorist is like, if you really understood that this reality is just all a test from, my particular God that you've never heard of, you would endorse me killing you, because actually under my belief system, I'm sending you to the highest heaven. And it's the only way to reach the highest heaven is to be killed by a spiritual warrior of my religion. So therefore, like, clearly, like, infinite utilities on the table. So this is all nonsense.
I feel like I'm like increasingly forming better models of where you're coming from and how you're seeing things. It's like, I'm trying to like pin you down on a crux that it's like not quite working. And like, that's fine. That's, I don't take issue with that or anything. There is kind of like a vibe of grace and turning the other cheek, that feels very central to my conception of perennialism and moral realism.
Oh, I do have a claim that you might be able to disagree with on this one. Well, maybe. So one question is like, practically, what do we get out of perennialism? One is like, we might be able to convince people that currently believe in exclusivity memes to believe in more pluralistic memes. And I believe that the reason that won't work is not because of the contents of their religious beliefs, but because part of what they're getting out of their degree of religious belief is the excuse to have conflict. So they pre-existingly, it's like humans are actually, well, this is a whole branch we didn't get into. Humans are actually homeostats in a bunch of dimensions. So for instance, if a person has a stress homeostat set at a young age, incorrectly, but maladaptively, I'll say, then as an adult, anytime stress level goes too low, they will mysteriously begin constructing scenarios in their life to generate more stress, so that their stress homeostat can return to the correct value. They don't realize they're doing this and probably wouldn't endorse it. But similarly, if a person has a conflict homeostat, they will seek out ideologies and representations within those ideologies that allow them to have the degree of conflict that they want. So a large number of people are not religious over the particular claims of their religion. They wanted to have a conflict. They found the shape of the conflict that they like, and they have beliefs in that direction. So I don't believe that it will work to spread a perennialist meme, because some people are literally optimizing for conflict.
Yeah, certainly not in any naive way. Like, I write a book about it and start a movement, and that, like, I don't think that's going to work.
I do think that work that is meaningful is undermining hell realms and other attractors that are on ramps to less adaptive regions of the configuration space, and that this is like very non-trivial, sometimes very local. I think that this is an example of like a different version of perennialism, because like I have sort of tacitly asserted some sort of grounding for health against maladaptivity over the course of this, which you might say is included in a useful definition of perennialism. but I believe it's often like highly local and contingent on particular local factors, like exactly which types of hell realms or any kind of maladaptive realm people are falling into, and developing antidotes. It's like developing antidotes for specific viruses, more so than it is jumping to the end and say, well, because like the broader claim is something like, well, capacity for building antidotes is valuable. So therefore, what are the set of conditions under which those smart people can be funded? They can get together, they can do their work in peace, they can, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like they need free and open society for, publishing of papers, et cetera, et cetera. Because since we generally know that developing vaccines is useful, we need to protect those things. The equivalent here is the people trying to bomb the vaccine centers, which there's probably people who would like to do that currently. This is even more relevant the last few years than it was before then. And then you have people doing, gain of function under the auspices of, but we're improving vaccine research while generating huge amounts of risk. And it's a pretty obvious one, right? If your religion, just like any other game theoretic thing, if your religion has a penchant for revenge, this is one of the low level things it can use as a leveraging point against people. Oh, and then I was saying that developing hell realm antidotes. And I was saying it was like highly local. So I don't think that jumping straight to, at the high level, we all agree with each other, is like, I don't think that really helps you develop the local antidotes to the particular attractors that extremize people and sort of turn them into cancer. I think the intuition there is pretty obvious, like turns them into replicators for just maximizing memes rather than any kind of interesting thing.
You think like stuff around grace and turning the other cheek doesn't? Is that what you were saying?
So I believe so for instance, I don't claim to like have a full understanding of like why these religious memes operate as they do. I only have, my own understanding. So for example, that meme is about breaking out, at least among other things, is about breaking out of defect cycles. So you want tit for tat with forgiveness is just straightforwardly globally superior to tit for tat without forgiveness.
Okay, I will say that if that's what turning the other cheek were all about, like if that were it, that would feel like a crux for me for like my overall position.
I don't think that's probably all that it's doing. I think that all of the religious memes are compressions. In the same way, so I think of virtues as compressions over like lots of low-level decision procedures that people follow, and that you can't transmit a virtue because like literally it is like it just is the compressed thing. Similarly, religious aphorisms that come down to us, they come down to us via a selection process for being useful, like the I Ching or something, right? It's like this is so broadly useful across such a large number of decision procedures that it winds up helping out in a bunch of scenarios for people at various levels of psychological development, et cetera, et cetera. So it's doing more than one thing. And the readout of what it's doing is like not totally obvious. I guess maybe part of the force of what I'm saying is driven by this sense of like there's a conflict between exclusivists, or I don't remember the term we used, exclusive versions of the meme and pluralists. And like right now, in the current configuration, exclusive memes are a lot more offense oriented. And I think my claim is that pluralists should be willing to deploy a lot more force to defend conceptions or equilibria where in theory progress is possible, because the other, like some versions of the other side, are not actually interested in that. They're interested in turning things into cancer, right? Only replicate this.
And I guess I just want to flag that one thing I find interesting about my reading of Muhammad is that like he was like on this reading, he was a pluralist who wanted to give grace and turn the other cheek to everyone he possibly could. And also the adversary was trying to kill him, and he had to do something about that. But the particular ways in which he did something about that, including how he minimized his use of violence, at least in my reading, and made a bunch of moves that seemed ridiculous or unacceptable to his followers in the short term, but in the long run, because of the spiritual upper hand it gave him and like the moral authority it gained him among like all the other people who were onlookers, those were a lot of what ended up cementing his victory and the power that he held afterwards.
early religions have to optimize for horizontal mimetic transmission because by definition they haven't built up enough base yet to do mostly vertical. But then they typically shift later on, right? Horizontal memes, so you're pointing to the property that they have to seem good to the people who are adopting them, as opposed to being indoctrinated. But they also can be, as many people have noted, they can be more virulent and cancerous in the sense that they don't mind burning through large portions of the population. Whereas the vertically transmissible memes at least have to keep children healthy long enough to reproduce themselves. So there's a definite goods and bads there.
I think as we're coming up on time, one thing we can do is just take turns seeing if you could just do your best to summarize where you think the disagreement is, and then I have maybe one or two more questions for each of you. And so since Alex, you've been giving it a shot already, maybe I'll throw it to Romeo first.
So I think Alex is leaning a lot more heavily on this idea that we should be investigating some of the surviving religious memes much more closely on the thesis that they are in fact like these deeply compressed things that we don't fully understand and that have deep wisdom built into them, both explicitly by the people who were seeing deeper symmetries than we are, and implicitly through their navigation of the world, whether or not they've been successful in the world in causing large groups of people to coordinate together. And that clearly the world's religions have are more powerful coordination technology than most of the modern economic stuff going on. Well, in a certain sense, that's a whole rabbit hole, but in a certain sense is more powerful. And so it would behoove us to not throw that wisdom out.
Alex, what do you think of that?
That all sounds accurate and consistent with my view. I think with a bunch of caveats that I do think it's a mistake to dismiss what's in the world religions, but I think I have a particular orientation toward interpreting them that makes it particularly fruitful for like me in particular to get useful kinds of value from them that I don't know would necessarily generalize.
Yeah, I think the conflict that there, at least one important dimension would be, for me, the important aspect is pedagogical. Like all that matters at the larger scale is what can be transmitted.
Yeah, and I think like one sort of orientation difference is that like I'm sort of putting the work on myself to do the heavy lifting of gleaning the right bits from the religion rather than sort of like asking from the religions to give me the right bits. And that's like part of where I feel like I'm getting a lot of the value from it.
Yeah, you're taking personal responsibility for the pedagogical gap. And to your earlier point, Romeo, there's like it's like that's developmentally gated. Some people just wouldn't be able to do that. And that's what matters. That seems to be what you're prioritizing, Romeo. And
it also it helps you know. So if you are going to deploy martial force, which is like, morally fraught at all times,
yeah,
this is a better basis than most other bases that I know of. It's like, okay, how can you guard children's context where they get to like grow and explore and learn, and like we can just treat as the bad guys people who are like, nope, let's indoctrinate and do violence against children. And it's like, that might sound obvious, but if you take that to its logical extreme, it puts you at odds with a substantial fraction of the world's population. So I think it's actually non-trivial.
And Alex, is there anything you would add to your representation of the disagreement?
I remember mentioning shortly before the call started that I feel like Romeo and I are constituted differently as people, and that's where like the main differences between us. And to the extent we have intellectual disagreements, they seem largely downstream of our predispositions from how we're constituted differently as people. On a vibe level, I feel like there's something Romeo is like cares a lot about around sort of like not underestimating the extent of the adversary / evil, which there's sort of like a collective human tendency to do. And I think Romeo is is better at doing that than I am. On the flip side, I feel like something that I feel like I'm carrying a real hard is like connecting with the innocence buried underneath all of the evil / the adversary, and that sort of being a crucial part of the overall worldview that I'm constructing and trying to elaborate. These two dispositions are not actually in conflict, I think, but I think in practice I'm probably biased to see more of the innocence and like to blind myself to some of the depth of evil, and I suspect there's an analogous opposite bias in Romeo's case. I do think that the bit about like the innocence behind all of the evil does feel like a very, very crucial component of my overall views on moral realism and its interactions with its relationship with perennialism. And I was kind of flippantly thinking that, yeah, one way I would summarize my disagreement with Romeo is that I think I feel more awed by Jesus Christ than Romeo.
Throughout the conversation, I was getting this like memory of something I learned in Sunday school of how God, the Christian God, is holding like the paradox of both like love and justice, and how those two things might be seen to be at odds with one another as you read the Bible, but ultimately there's a synthesis there. And it kind of seemed like you're both representing each side of that, you know, Alex on the love side and Romeo on the justice side. And I thought that was kind of elegant.
And it also seems sort of like worth noting that most of the concrete claims Romeo was making, I didn't really find myself disagreeing with. And the conflict almost seemed like it existed more on like a vibe level between how we were holding the term perennialism than well, like whenever we like pin things down to specific concrete claims, I think we found ourselves agreeing for the most part, which seems interesting and relevant.
For each of you, is there anything you'd like to leave the listeners with? Starting with you, Romeo.
I guess I would sum up my sense of the disagreement as it is tempting. Humans have an inbuilt tendency to try to do A, B, C, D, E. Oh, I've seen this before, Z, because it's efficient. And a surprising number of things in reality are path dependent, such that you writing that bottom line first is just a terrible mistake. And it's a mistake a lot more often than people realize. And even if you do ultimately arrive at Z, it is worth slowly and carefully going through the entire alphabet. And jumping to very high level claims, I think I try to develop rigorous pushback towards, because I think it basically doesn't help that much and sometimes hurts, because it elides a lot of the conflicts and the ways the rubber meets the road where we have failed to develop exactly those tools that will allow us to navigate those local conflicts that would ultimately add up into something more.
I think if I had Romeo's orientation toward pedagogy, toward my broad high-level claims, I would share his... I would resonate a lot more with what he just said himself. I think part of how I personally hold these high-level claims is by sort of running them as active experiments, where, for example, when I end up in conflicts with loved ones, there's sort of the constant tension that I'm navigating around balancing justice and love. And the pedagogical curriculum I'm setting for myself basically is, it's like, yeah, don't underestimate the depths of people's shadows. Also remember that there's innocence at the bottom of this. Okay, now my family or my partner is being unbearable. What do I do? Well, let me do the best I can, remembering both of these things and try to navigate that. I think there's something about the point about grace and forgiveness and particular where I think a lot of what it's about in my interpretation is something like, if you want to see and feel the innocence underneath your own shadow, you're going to have to extend grace and forgiveness to other people's shadows, which doesn't mean like rolling over or like even letting them like slap your cheek the second time. Like it might look like you're still standing up to them and stuff. But there is something very empirical, I feel like, around what I'm trying to do, around sort of like running experiments for myself of like, oh, if I see this person's innocent in this way, like what predictions about their behavior can I make from that? Like in terms of both how much they're going to attack me / how receptive they're going to be to like various forms of kindness on my end. For me, the willingness to run the experiments around forgiving others' shadows and my own shadows, and balancing that with like the experiments of like standing up to them when I previously wouldn't otherwise do so, has been crucial for figuring out this tension in myself. And I don't know that it's like possible for anyone to figure out how to resolve this tension without running these kinds of experiments in themselves. Those are my last thoughts.
Guys, thank you so much for this conversation today. That was awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you for
Thank
hosting.
you both as well.